complete. And this story is very much like that. In order to get into it this morning from a sermonic perspective, I'd like to share with you a true story of my own, a story of an experience that occurred and took place in my life, back in my former life, as the program coordinator and educational travel consultant for Seminars International in Chicago. I was privileged during that 17-year period to work on a number of very interesting and exciting travel study programs, and this particular event took place as I was traveling to Edinburgh, Scotland, in preparation for an arrangement, or rather for a program for the Second Presbyterian Church in Indianapolis, Indiana. They were to travel to Edinburgh the following year in celebration of their 150th anniversary. And my work on that program took me to Edinburgh the year before the actual group experience, and I found myself calling on the pastor of St. Giles Cathedral, the mother church of Presbyterianism. The pastor's name was the Reverend Dr. Gillespie Macmillan, no less. I don't know about you, but every time I go to meet someone I've never met before and I have some idea of some information about them, I always try to build a vision in my mind as to what they might look like, and I was absolutely, fully, completely accurate, except for the fact that he was a bit younger than I had expected. He was rather bookish in his appearance. He looked exactly like you would expect the pastor of St. Giles Cathedral to look. He was wearing a shaggy and bulky Harris tweed jacket with those worn places on the elbow. You've seen those. They're practically year-round attire in Scotland. It was a Monday morning in May. I was oozing with breezy Midwestern friendliness, which Europeans and people in the UK don't always quite know how to take, as I was visiting with the Reverend Dr. Gillespie Macmillan and feeling like I was getting absolutely nowhere very fast. I was trying to negotiate some special arrangements for my new best friends, the Presbyterians of Indianapolis. And I think part of Dr. Macmillan's response to me was not only that he was put off by my breezy Midwestern manner, but also due to the fact that I was telling him about an anticipated invasion of 150 Hoosier Presbyterians that were going to descend not only on his fair city, but upon his venerable cathedral. On the one hand, I sort of had the impression that he was looking forward to the prospect of having 150 people in worship in addition to his own congregation. I had been there just the day before, and let me tell you, they were more than a tad shy of 150. In that dusty, dark, old medieval cathedral. I don't think on that particular Sunday morning there were even 75, but the thing that really got to Dr. Gillespie Macmillan was when I asked him if they might be able to offer some kind of a light meal after the service. Well, the man fell ashen. I explained that I was looking for an opportunity for 150 American visitors because that was the goal of the size goal for the group, and they did reach that. That I was looking for an opportunity for our American visitors to meet and to mingle with the members and the worshipers of St. Giles Cathedral. He blustered out his reply, well, we couldn't possibly provide a catering opportunity for that many people. I mean, we just don't simply have the funds. Well, he went on to explain and make every effort to discourage me from my harebrained idea. His objections continued to mount. I tried to explain them away and asked if he had ever attended an American church potluck dinner. Well, he assured me he had not. I tried to explain to him what that was all about, and it did not impress him at all. He began to grasp at every possible straw he could reach for as he tried to discourage me and kill my idea. He next raised the issue of a venue. That was his word. In other words, where we'd hold this. Well, I had thought about that the day before. I'd anticipated a possible venue problem because I had visited many medieval cathedrals and they didn't usually build fellowship halls in them. So after church that day before, I took a walk around the immediate precincts surrounding the cathedral, and I turned a corner, and lo and behold, there was a lovely little park, not but a matter of 2 or 3, maybe 4 minutes walk away. So I suggested that to him as a possible place where we might have, instead of a catered meal, perhaps even just a picnic. Well, he looked at me and said, well, that's a fine idea, but we've got all sorts of problems with that one. You see, we've got the street people of Edinburgh. I mean, they're all going to be there, and they're going to want something to eat. How will we ever control that lot? And how can we possibly know how much food to prepare for? And the poor man was trying to be kind, and I felt that at any moment he was going to get up and just simply, boldly ask me to leave. Well, instead, he sat there for a moment and began scratching his head, and at that point I reached out. I touched his hand on his chair, and I said, Dr. McMillan, come now. Jesus managed to feed 5,000 men plus women and children out in the remote Galilean hillside country. Surely you and I can come up with a plan to take care of a mere 300 at the most, plus a few street people, right here in the heart of Edinburgh. Well, with that he dissolved into laughter, reached for his pipe, began to stuff it full of a wonderful aromatic tobacco, lit it, and puffed out a big, huge billow of smoke and looked me in the eye and said, Robert, you're a persistent American rascal. We'll do it. I'm not sure how, but we'll do it. Well, a year later, almost to the day, by golly, they did it. It was both simple and grand. Hoosiers met Scotsmen. The street people came and they were fed, and there was enough left to fill not a dozen baskets, but 3 or 4 that were taken to a nearby shelter for the poor in Edinburgh. And by the way, a year or so later I visited and spoke to Dr. Gillespie McMillan at the conclusion of the service. He remembered me, as well one might imagine, after all of that, and he shared with me the fact that the congregation of St. Giles Cathedral had become so enamored with that little experience that they decided to sponsor an annual gathering every year about that time, and the sole purpose of it was to feed the homeless of Edinburgh. Friendships were struck. Some jobless folk found work. Some homeless folk found shelter. Some lonely folk found friends. And there always seemed to be enough food to go around, he said. Well, I have no idea what was going on in the life of the Venerable Reverend Dr. Gillespie McMillan that Monday, over 10 years ago, when I entered into his life and proposed this preposterous idea. His life may well have been full to the top with all sorts of things. That invitation to do one more thing may have just been one more thing too much. I know. I've been there. I had a Thursday like that just 3 days ago, and so have many of you. We've all tried to retreat under the cover of not enough. As for Jesus and his disciples, the day that this particular story took place, that day out in rural Galilee, their plate was full and their hearts were burdened. Yes, I suspect even to the point of panic, because the 12 verses prior to the ones that we read this morning that John shared with us tell us of the story of the execution, yes, the beheading of John the Baptist, the cousin of Jesus. Things were heating up in the political arena of the time. The outspoken John had called attention to the shenanigans of the puppet king Herod, who was involved with his brother Philip's wife. John dared to publicly declare that that was unlawful and inappropriate, and to that in-your-face confrontation, King Herod had him beheaded. Matthew writes, "Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself." What Jesus heard was some shocking and frightening news. This was crushing news for Jesus. He withdrew to a deserted place in an attempt to be alone. Well, what happened? The story tells us that there followed behind him a large crowd of people, 5,000, Matthew suggests. That's a lot of people, and maybe that's all Matthew intended to say, was that there were a lot of them. Who was actually counting, I don't know. It was late in the day when Jesus saw them. He took pity and had compassion for them, and he began to heal their sick and to address their needs. Well, when the disciples showed up, it was an entirely different response to the whole situation. These guys were literally running scared. By this time, they had had enough, and they wanted the whole thing to come to an end, for all things to cool down. This mob scene, I'm sure they felt, was not going to go over well with the authorities. They could be charged with inciting a riot. Rome and Herod get pretty skittish about this sort of thing. Get rid of them. This is a deserted place. Send them home to get something to eat. It sounds like a practical solution to a very big problem. But then Jesus does what Jesus so often does, a knowing fellow that he is. In essence, he says you can't turn your back on this. Matthew reports him saying, they do not need to go away. You give them something to eat. Oh no, Jesus. Not again. Things are really bad this time. John is dead. He's been executed. He's had his head cut off. Taking care of this rabble could get us all into a lot of trouble. The story doesn't recount this, but you can feel that sense of rejection to this incredible situation that they were going through. They pull out all of the obvious problems in fulfilling the directive that Jesus is giving them. We don't have enough food, and we don't even have enough money to buy food if we were anywhere where we could buy some. We just do not have enough to meet the demands of this moment in our lives. It's too much to ask of us. Let us step aside. See here, this is all we have, just 5 loaves and 2 fishes. You can see that this just isn't enough. Don't be a fool, man. Send them home. Let us go home. Don't ask us to take on this responsibility. We've had it, Jesus. Give us a break. How obvious it seems to take refuge under the cover of not enough. It makes perfectly good sense to us, and more often than not, when the cards are stacked against us, the situation is just too much, and besides, everybody can clearly see that it's too much. We would say in our vernacular, this is not rocket science. I've felt it myself, and you have felt it. I've heard it in some of your voices at times. Enough already. I don't want to handle this. I can sense it in the voice of my friend Sharon. She's the mother of my young friend Scott Cernicki from Chicago, who died just 2 years ago on June the 19th. He choked to death on a piece of meat. He was alone. He was 31 years old and youthful and full of hope for life. And now Sharon's oldest daughter, Nancy, only 45, is a mother and struggling in the final stages of a pervasive and aggressive cancer. And just this past February, another daughter of hers who suffered with incredible back injuries and surgery after surgery, finally unable to handle the persistent and constant pain, took her own life. I can hear it in Sharon's voice. I'm not sure how she manages some days to even get up and face the ordinary activities of the day. Don't give me any more, she says. I can't handle it. There isn't enough of me left to go around. Give me a break, life. Well, how does this all connect with our story this morning? Let's go back to it for a moment. Of all of the miracle stories in all of the accounts in the 4 Gospels, this one is probably the easiest one to explain away, to demythologize. It's easy to tell us and to imagine how it might have happened. You've heard the explanations about the young lad innocently coming forward and presenting what he had brought along that day for lunch, probably much to his mother's chagrin, and how, seeing that gesture of generosity, others around him surely must have felt inspired to have delved into their own cloaks and under their own folds of garments and to have brought out the little stashes that they had, and one after another revealing their lunches, finally there was enough for everyone to have more than enough. Well, that's all good and well. But none of that is in the gospel that is written and been preserved for us. Matthew doesn't explain the event, he just reported it. And like virtually all miracle stories, the minute you move toward demythologizing them, you end up destroying them. When it comes to the miracle narratives, it is less a matter of how it was done, and more important that it was done, and equally important why it was done. Don't get caught up in trying to explain away the miracle. Let its presence simply be there, and let it be a story that speaks to you. It is interesting to note that this incredible story of the feeding of the 5,000 is preserved in every one of the four Gospels, and not every one of the miracles appears in all four, but this one does. I firmly believe that all four writers of the four Gospels had the same purpose in retaining this story. And that purpose, I think, very simply was to discourage us from seeking refuge in the perception of our own limitations. Last Monday morning, I watched the ESPN interview of Lance Armstrong, the American cyclist who has apparently not only won the Tour de France rather significantly, but also who has won a battle with what had been diagnosed just 2 short years ago as certain fatal cancer. In fact, the very reporter that was interviewing him recounted an experience of having gone to interview him just after his diagnosis, and walking into the hospital, the doctor who was there stepped up to him and said, "Don't get too close to this young man. He isn't going to be around 3 months from now." The young athlete said, and I quote in this interview on ESPN last Monday, "Everywhere I turned, I was told it can't be done. When I was diagnosed with cancer, my team immediately fired me. When I started my comeback, I was told I couldn't compete because I would lose. I simply refused to believe that." End of quote. Lance Armstrong not only won, he won big. And through that interview, I was not only impressed by this young man's determination, but I was especially impressed by his absolute lack and failure of arrogance, claiming what he had accomplished. I was also touched that he did not assign this event to the miraculous intervention of God, which to me is often a kind of arrogance in and of itself. I do not deny that this is indeed an event of miraculous proportions. But what troubles me about the quick jump to the identification of a miracle is the way that it feels arrogant to me that God would set things aside for him and his cancer while someone else is dying. Why? I do believe in miracles, but I'm hesitant to point to them. Actually, I don't even want to go there except to make the observation that Lance Armstrong didn't go there either. What I do want to say is that he stood in the face of an insurmountable experience and refused to say it can't be done, and refused to listen to others who tried to convince him that it can't be done. He seemed to be implying, through the absence of saying much at all about it, that there was a real mystery in the whole event of his recovery and his Tour de France win. And when we take refuge under the cover of not enough, or under the cover of I can't do that, or under the cover of the ever popular it's too much to ask of me now, what we are actually doing is turning our backs on the mystery of the possibility that there is enough, that we can do it, that it isn't too much. We just don't know. We have so little control over our lives in crisis, except to the extent that we can control and we can shut off possibilities by shutting down our sense of hope and our sense of willingness to risk the mystery of what is going to happen next. It is easy to take refuge rather than to take risks. Frequently in my own experience, there comes a time when, quite frankly, reason reaches its limit, and faith alone allows me to ascend beyond the moment. Frequently, there comes a time when if I were to cave into reason, everything would for sure come to an end, and I have done that. Thank you, Matthew and Mark and Luke and John, for preserving this incredible story for us. And thank you, Lance Armstrong, for your incredible courage and determination. And thank you, Jesus, for telling your disciples they need not go away. You give them something to eat. Are there 500 men plus women and children standing in front of you somewhere in your life needing to be fed in some sense? Is there some impossible task looming before you, waiting for you to address it? Is there a situation in life that could use a miracle and that you are convinced will not receive one, so you simply decided to send it packing? Is there something you're about to turn your back on, shutting down your sense of hope and willingness to risk the mystery of what is going to happen next? Seemingly small and insignificant amounts of resources in the hands of people of faith, people who will not shut down hope, who will not refuse to risk the mystery of what is going to happen next, do multiply beyond our comprehension, not always to the end that we would hope for. Yes, even to the point, however, of leftovers for another time. Lance Armstrong concluded that interview on Monday with these words. He said, "I had no idea when I started my comeback training that I'd end up being a better athlete than before, or that I'd end up being a better person than I was before." Matthew 14:20 through 21 reads as follows, "And all ate and were filled. And they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children." Pray with me. Heavenly God, we stand present to life in its sometimes awesome demands, and it is so easy for us to cave into the sense of our own limitations. Help us to risk the mystery of what will be next, trusting in you and surrendering ourselves. In Jesus' name we pray.